Our next speaker is Professor Helen Marshall, Professor of Vaccinology at the University of Adelaide and head of Medical Director of the Vaccinology and Immunology Trials Group.
Yeah, great.
And you're going to speak on...
New vaccines.
New vaccines,
yes,
terrific. Thank you.
New diseases. Pleasure. And look, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I haven't been to this meeting for a year or two, so it's just fabulous. It feels like, it's the big extended family I haven't seen for a few years. So, okay, what I'm going to do is, obviously, I could give you a whole list of all the new vaccines that are in development, but I'm not going to do that because I've only got 20 minutes. I'm going to focus on giving you one example in each sort of age cohort across the life course. So we're going to look at a new maternal vaccine that's around the corner, one for children, one for adolescents and for adults, and then just really a very brief slide on new delivery systems, which has already been raised tonight. So the first one for infants, so protection against infant sepsis, so Group B strep disease and vaccines are in development. And just to remind you, it's really a major cause. I think it's a little bit like meningococcal disease. It's got that high case fatality rate, around 8%. It's uncommon, and so it's always going to be difficult in cost effectiveness analyses for the vaccine to be cost effective. But the sequelae from it are really severe. And so, obviously infants can die, but they can be left with lots of developmental problems. I guess there's an estimated 91,000 deaths per year, but the other important issue is around stillbirth. So it's a cause of stillbirth, and again, stillbirth, in addition to that, preterm delivery as well, which is, as you know, associated with lots of long-term disability and costs. Now, the World Health Organization has had major concerns really about low to middle income countries because they really carry most of the burden of disease from Group B strep. And so it has been identified that Group B strep vaccines should be a priority for development, and there has been a target set that we'll have the first Group B strep vaccine available in 2026. I don't think we're quite there yet, but there is complexity in these vaccines, and I'll just show you where we're up to. There's 10 different serotypes, and serotype 3 seems to be the cause of most infant cases globally. So just to show you the vaccines that are being developed at the moment. So there's one from Pfizer, one from Minovax, that are in phase 2 trials. Now, the first one, the Pfizer one, is a conjugate vaccine and includes those serotypes there, including the 3 that, that's better, thank you, the 3 that causes most infant deaths, and then there's a fusion protein, the Minovax vaccine that's in phase 2 trials as well. There was a vaccine being developed, a conjugate vaccine by GSK, but that has been discontinued. So the next step will be once, phase 2, moving into phase 3 trials. Again, because it's a rare infection, it's going to be very difficult to do large, you need tens of thousands of pregnant women and infants to measure the effectiveness. So it's likely that that will rely on immunogenicity, but also important once your vaccines are licensed and delivered in programs that we look at the real-world evidence to estimate the vaccine effectiveness, to make sure that once a vaccine's in a program, it's actually doing what it's supposed to do. And there's no correlate of protection, which makes this all a bit complicated. So as I mentioned, the roadmap is really to have a vaccine available by 2026 and licensed in 10 countries by 2030. So a little bit behind in that, I think, but hopefully make some progress soon. I'm just showing you this really to make the point that's really important with any new vaccine, that you understand the epidemiology of your disease in your country or your area. And this is some work we're doing that's been funded in South Australia, looking at the serotypes, the MLST types, to really make sure that the isolates that are causing disease in our infants and also in our pregnant women, what they're carrying, are going to be covered by vaccines that will become available. So if we look at children then, Group A strep is an infection that's very common, causes pharyngitis, but it has more impact really by the immune-mediated disease it causes, particularly for our First Nations children with rheumatic heart disease. So as you know, common cause of pharyngitis, that razor blade pain that kids or young people talk about, that really needs to be treated with antibiotics. But also is the cause of skin sores and cellulitis. But then we have the invasive disease, the sepsis, the necrotising fasciitis, and toxic shock syndrome. And we've seen an increase in those cases more recently in our hospitals. And then, as I mentioned, the immune-mediated sequelae are really important in thinking about disease burden. With rheumatic heart disease, it leads to valvular disease and can end up in cardiac failure. And then one of the commonest causes of renal failure in First Nations people is this post-strep glomerulonephritis. We did some work about 10 years ago looking at carriage of Group A strep, and this is across the whole of Australia. It was led from South Australia, but all states were involved. Well, it was really a cross-sectional study where we looked at just taking a throat swab from children in from birth up to 18, and we found about 5% of children were positive for Group A strep. As you can see in this graph, where the x-axis is the age and then antibody levels going up the y-axis, as age increased, antibody levels increased, carriage increased, and we found that the age of the child, obviously the geographic location and number of children in that household where there's overcrowding, increased the presence of antibodies. So really telling us that a Group A strep vaccine that was available should really be given in the first or second year of life, early on, before all of that disease burden. Now, I just want to mention the STAMPS study. Now, this is being led by Jonathan Karapetis and Andrew Steer here in Australia, and the reason why I've chosen Group A strep really is because Australia is really a world leader in this area, and so we're all involved now in a multi-centre prospective longitudinal study looking again at the frequency of Group A strep in children, and really importantly moving then into First Nations children to make sure that the strains that are causing disease in our First Nations children are going to be adequately covered by any vaccine that goes forward. So we don't have a vaccine available yet, but there are a number of vaccines that are in preclinical or phase 1 or going into phase 1. So this is really how the vaccines are developed, based on the bacteria, the M protein being the important virulence protein of the Group A strep, and various components of the M protein are being developed into vaccines. And then you'll see also the non-M proteins. The problem with the M protein is that there's a lot of diversity, and so it's always much harder with lots of variability in that particular protein to ensure that there's good coverage. So that's a list of the table showing you the different vaccines for Group A strep, some from the States, some from Australia being developed, and one by GSK using these different components of the bacteria. So we're really at a very early stage in Group A strep, but I think with Australia leading the world, it's a really important vaccine to know how that's progressing. So adolescents, so meningococcal disease, many of you who know me know that my particular area of interest is meningococcal disease and vaccines. And so pentavalent MenACWY vaccines are available. I'll show you, well, going to be available in the States and are available in the States. But I also want to talk to you about how we might repurpose a vaccine, because gonorrhea, being a very closely related to the meningococcus, both being Neisseria species, we know from the evidence that's being generated, this evidence of cross-protection against gonorrhea. And there are no gonorrhea-specific vaccines available. There were, but haven't really progressed through to anywhere near phase 3 to be available. So Could we repurpose a vaccine such as a MenB OMV vaccine to be a vaccine against gonorrhoea? Now, you'll all be familiar with gonorrhoea, but just to be clear, oh well, sorry, I don't mean personally. I'm sorry, I don't mean personally. I feel very familiar with it, but burden of disease mostly affects women and children. So just think about that. Unfortunately for women, a lot of the disease is asymptomatic, and they therefore don't get treated. And if they have 3 or more infections or untreated, they have greater than 50% chance of being infertile or having fertility problems. The other thing to note, of course, increasing antibiotic resistance, so that we might have untreatable gonorrhoea. 24 times higher risk for First Nations people. So this is another really important area. If we could have some way of providing some protection against this infection in adolescents. So we know from the New Zealand study that was published, they had seen in Cuba, where they had seen an ecological decrease in gonorrhoea after introducing a specific MenB vaccine. They hypothesised with the New Zealand Men's B program that they might see a reduction in gonorrhoea, and they actually estimated a vaccine effectiveness of 31%. Now, that paper came out just as we were introducing a MenB program in South Australia. So we had an opportunity here to assess not only how well the vaccine program was going in South Australia, but also against meningococcal disease, but also against gonorrhoea. And you all know now Queensland and Northern Territory also have 4C MenB or Bexzero meningococcal B programs. Ours was quite extensive. We had anyone with an age-specific notification rate over the average notification rate for meningococcal disease got included in our cohort. So we had about 8 years included in that program. The catch-up program didn't continue, but we're continuing obviously for infants and adolescents. So we were really interested in looking at this impact on gonorrhoea. And I'm just going to show you this data, which we're just about to submit for publication. We have already published it 2 and 3 years, but this is 5 years after introducing Bexzero in South Australia. And note down the bottom there is no indication for Bexzeros to be used for prevention of meningococcal B disease. There's no indication for protection against gonorrhoea, just to be clear there. So this is very much research. What we found is if you've received your 2 doses, that whole cohort, up to 5 years after we introduced the program, there's 40% vaccine effectiveness against gonorrhoea. That's significant, and we have a 35% relative reduction in incidence of gonococcal infection in 15 to 17-year-olds. We were also interested in this question about, well, does that last? Because if you've only got about a 40% vaccine effectiveness, which is sort of moderate, that's better than flu most years, then is that going to last? And so we have done a subgroup analysis looking at those who are that cohort within 5 years of vaccination, and those who received their vaccine more than 5 years ago. And you'll see that although the confidence intervals overlap with our 40% estimate overall, it nudges up a little bit if you exclude anyone more than 5 years. But obviously there's no protection there after 5 years. Now, these are very small numbers, so it's something we've got to continue to watch, but maybe it's 4 to 6 years you still get some protection against gonorrhoea, and slightly higher in females, but not significantly. And we did also look at whether if you had a gonococcal infection, did you have a reduced chance of a second episode if you're vaccinated? And yes, you do. So it's not just our evidence, there is mounting evidence. There's now 8 studies around the world showing the same thing. A vaccine effectiveness about 30 to 40%. There are several randomised controlled trials that are also in development at the moment. And just to say really overall, it looks like it's probably about a 32% vaccine effectiveness if you do a systematic review of all of those studies. There is a biological mechanism here. It's not just a, interesting observational study outcome. We know that because they're both Neisseria species, they're highly closely related with 90% genetic homology. They're both mucosal pathogens, if you think about it, and meningococcus actually sits there in the nasopharynx, oropharynx, the gonococcus in the genital regions, and then they invade. We know that Bexero or 4C-MAN-B does induce antibodies that recognise gonococcal proteins. The vaccine has NHBA, which is a protein that is found in the gonococcus as well. So there's good evidence for why this might be happening, but also from our carriage study we did in South Australia, although we didn't see a reduction in capsulated meningococci, we did see a significant reduction in unencapsulated meningococci, and the gonococcus being unencapsulated, I'm sure there is a mechanism there. Without a capsule, there's better exposure of those outer membrane proteins as well. So I had to just sneak this in too. It's really to show the effectiveness against meningococcal disease in South Australia. So at 5 years, if you're an infant, you've had your 3 doses, you have the vaccine effectiveness is 98.5%. And I'm just telling you that because it's not what was expected. It's expected with Men-B vaccines because they're protein-based, it would wane. But it doesn't. 5 years out, 98.5% vaccine effectiveness, and for adolescents, 92.6%. So, impact, again, we've seen a reduction in meningococcal disease in infants and adolescents that's significant there, around 75% for both. So, this could be an example of a first vaccine, really, for prevention of gonococcal infection, which is a huge burden around the world. The Joint Committee on Vaccines and Immunisation, and Shamez Ladani, we're going to hear from soon too, from the UK, advised me as soon as this decision was made that 4C-MAN-B is now offered to those at high risk of gonococcal infection. That's despite an indication in the product information. Based on all the evidence, which I've told you, they have decided now to recommend 4C-MAN-B or Bexero to those at high risk of gonococcal infection. As I said, we don't have a recommendation in Australia, just to be clear about that. There is no indication. But I think we should be advocating, and this is what we've just been hearing from Kirsty as well, around, particularly for First Nations people. Why wouldn't we have a program for First Nations adolescents where rates of both those diseases are higher? But we still have questions remaining about whether you'd need, if you're using it for gonorrhoea, would you need a booster when you're reach 20 or whatever? So we're very pleased we've been awarded, and Peter Richmond and Shamez and others who may be on the call, a team of 20 of us who have been awarded an NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence in this area to really to devise the best, most effective and cost-effective immunisation program to protect against meningococcal disease and gonorrhoea. So I did mention ABCWY, and just to get you up to date on that, obviously adolescents hate needles, and if we could have vaccines that gave less needles, wouldn't that be wonderful? So combination meningococcal ABCWY vaccines, there are several available. The Pfizer vaccine was licensed and approved for use in 16 to 23-year-olds in October of 2023 in the States. And the GSK one has been submitted to the FDA, and there'll be an outcome on the 14th of February this year. So that's very close. Just to reiterate, all of the serogroups cause disease in Australia, so a pentavalent vaccine would be very useful. And studies have shown whether you use it as a primary booster or as a booster after Bexero or after any of the MenACWY vaccines, it's effective. Okay, just to finish up, and we already heard a little bit from Kirsty just now about influenza COVID vaccine, so adults and older adults, whatever that age would be. As you all know, COVID influenza, huge burden if we could combine it. And it's interesting, preferences down the bottom there, preferences for combination vaccines, 66% of consumers and 84% of healthcare workers prefer a multi-component flu. Well, that's not surprising, over having vaccines separately. So there are a number of these. A Pfizer vaccine combined influenza and COVID vaccine has completed phase 3, as has Moderna. The Pfizer one, they didn't reach the primary endpoint around the B, influenza B, so I think they're going to go back and tweak that, was the indication from the paper. But The Moderna one has completed phase 3 successfully. And then Novavax, I think, are recruiting here in Australia, recruiting participants for a combined vaccine. And then there, look, we've got a nasal spray vaccine. So there you go, John. There's your nasal spray combined influenza COVID vaccine. So I'm really just going to finish off here and say, obviously, delivery systems are, a really exciting potential area, as we've already indicated. Nanopatches, and a lot of work's going on in Queensland around that. Phase 1 studies, I think it's flu. And then if you think about the trials in children, I think it's a really exciting area to get away from needles. Some of us here in the room have been doing, DNA COVID vaccine trials and using devices like the PharmaJet, which actually you just put on the skin and push, and a jet of fluid goes to muscle. I still can't get my head around that it actually gets in, but it does. And then, of course, nasal sprays, which, as we all have been discussing, are an important way for mucosal protection, vaccination. So really, just to conclude, I think, it's pretty endless, the endless possibilities for infectious disease prevention across the lifespan. Really important to understand your epidemiology when these new vaccines come. Are they going to cover the strains in your region? We know that for a number of vaccines. Opportunities to think creatively about vaccines, and the example I gave you around meningococcal disease and gonorrhoea with one vaccine. Cost effectiveness and equity in access. And I know we've all been talking about hesitancy and concerns, but I really think a lot of the reduction in uptake is access. We know because of all the economic problems that are happening currently, a lot of it is access, and we can actually do a lot about that. And then the future of needle-free delivery solutions is closer. Thank you.
Thank you. Time for questions. Helen, thank you.
Just wondering if you have any intel on, is it Vaxxus that have the needle-free patches, and what's happened to them?
Yeah. So that's what I was indicating actually, Alan. They've done, I think it's flu phase 1 trials, and they're wanting to start to do paediatric trials as well. So that's where we're hoping, obviously, around the country to be able to get involved in those. But they have progressed more quickly in the last year or two, and I don't have any more detailed information, but I did have a good discussion about all this just recently. So, it seems to be progressing a lot faster than it was, 5 years ago.